Hello, I'm Roy Steinberg. I'm the producing artistic director at Cape May Stage. And one of the perks of my job is during this pandemic, I have had the opportunity to talk with some of the most fascinating people. And today I'm going to be talking with Kim Powers. So welcome, Kim. See if you can find his video. And while he's doing that, there you are.
I'm
Hi
here.
there.
I'm here. How are you?
And for people,
there we go. That's good.
I was just reading that people of other races, when they see white people, they think they all look alike. And so now you and I look exactly alike because we're both wearing black, we both have glasses, and we both have beards.
We've passed the white people test. We look
have.
exactly the same.
We have. So by way of introduction, I'm going to say, Kim is a two-time Emmy Award winner. I'm just going to read this. He's the author of the novels Capote in Kansas and Dig Two Graves, as well as the memoir The History of Swimming. And of course, he wrote the play Sidekicked. And I know all this because I'm reading the back of his newest book, Rules for Being Dead, which we'll talk about shortly. Of course, Kim, you and I met really doing that play. I directed it, and it was such a wonderful collaboration. I mean, you are such a wonderful artistic collaborator.
I look back that on constantly as, just one of my best memories of the last few years, and just how perfect and special that was, kind of out of the blue. It came together pretty quickly. We had our wonderful collaborator in Sally Mays, and it just fits so perfectly in your little jewel box of a theater. You did such a good job on it. Everybody brought their love of I Love Lucy into it, as did the audience, I guess.
Yes.
And, occasionally, his pictures will pop up on my social media, on this day a year ago. So I'm constantly being reminded of it, and just had a great time, blast doing that play.
Yes, and Sally Mays was just so brilliant in it. I mean, playing Vivian Vance. And, the other part of it is, as you say, theater often is a wonderful, wonderful collaborative experience, but sometimes it's a nightmare. And
those are the dishy stories we really like to hear about.
Right. But there really weren't any. I mean, we all loved really, I mean, I did anyway. I loved working with Sally, loved working with you. And we all brought things to the table. I mean, you found all these marvelous pieces of video, which then I, as a director, found places to insert into the place, into the actual production. And Sally had all sorts of ideas about the text and Vivian herself and and so it was just a very, and I must tell you, if you don't know, it was one of the most successful in terms of financial productions we've ever had. We sold the most tickets and made the most money we ever have.
Well, I'm thrilled to hear that. And I remember you telling me that it was not, I mean, maybe on your part, it was an immediate decision, but that it was a little bit of a controversy. Some of your support team around you didn't think maybe it was the smartest choice, and it was about a kind of nostalgic subject. It was kind of romantic and sentimental. It wasn't kind of woke, in a very contemporary way, and might have been a little more old-fashioned. It's a one-person show, so It was the challenge of one person just commanding that stage for 90 minutes, however long it was. But I think we all believed in it, and it paid off. We worked our butts off on it.
Yes.
I mean, just think about that. I think 2 weeks rehearsal maybe for Sally.
Right.
2 weeks just to remember all those lines. Number one.
Well, I think she started
she started in advance, but just let alone that, and then bring them to life with this fully fleshed character, that she so inhabited. And the other thing I'm so happy about in terms of Sally is that I think so many people knew her and know her just as a singer, a cabaret performer, concert artist.
Right.
She's just this crackerjack artist. You saw every note on the scale, on the emotional acting scale in that performance.
Yes.
And just as a gift to her, I'm so glad we were able to bring that together and let the world see what I think we both hoped and knew she could pull off. Right.
Well, also, one of the surprises for many people, and it was something I did quite intentionally, was that though it is a nostalgic, sentimental subject, it was not just a dessert as an audience member. And in fact, and then later, only after the fact, did I find out that you were inspired by Samuel Beckett, in part, who's a playwright for whom I have enormous admiration, and to this day is the most controversial play we have ever done at Cape May Stage. I am still getting beaten up for having done Happy Days.
Well, I can't imagine any, kind of summer theater, pulling in tourists doing Beckett, number one. But you're exactly right. I mean, I had this idea forever and had, jotted little notes here and there. But it literally is only when I saw, the incredible Diane Wiest do the Beckett play Happy Days.
Right.
I thought, she's doing the same thing I want Vivian to do. She's just sitting and telling her story to an audience. And it's not just a string of anecdotes, funny anecdotes or gossipy anecdotes about Lucy. It's the depth of her soul as a person and this huge nervous breakdown she went through and all this stuff. I mean, it's a heavy duty part, and I'm glad the audience went along for the ride. It's like it needed the nostalgia, and I think the name I Love Lucy, everybody's heard of I Love Lucy, to bring them in the tent, as we say. But then they stayed there for everything, every new thing they learned about Vivian Vance, I think.
And I'll share with you, because it's germane to our point here, how I ended up doing Beckett at Cape May Stage. I mean, Cape May Stage is really a rather unique theater in that, though we are in a resort town, we don't just do lightweight, meals, but we do occasionally. My very first season at Cape May Stage, a very dear friend of mine who's passed on, Lynn Cohen.
Oh, yeah.
Brilliant.
Who just died this year, right? I
think died this past year.
A few months ago.
Exactly. A little longer than that. Yeah, but yes. Lynn, well, when I was at Yale Drama School, as you were, we all share that.
Right.
Lewis Black wrote a play about Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz as an old lady having been driven crazy by the Munchkins, as only Lewis Black. Right, and Lynn did a reading of it. And I thought, well, nobody will come, but at least we will have done it. Because it was a world premiere. Nobody would, it was a play only done at Yale Drama School. It was called Dottie's Home, and Dottie being crazy. And her home was like the old age home, not just her house. So that was the name of the play. Wow. Well, although we told everybody Lewis wasn't going to be there, I asked permission to do the play, and Lewis said, "You have my permission, just buy me a drink if I show up," that kind of thing. And the place was overpacked. You could not get a seat. People were hanging off the chandeliers. And after we did it, weeks later, I'd be walking in town, and a car would stop in the middle of the road, and they motion me over and say, "You're the guy from that theater, right?" And I said, "Yeah." And they would say, was the Scarecrow having sex with... And I said, "I don't know. What do you think?" And I realized people were really engaged in this. And if they could follow Lewis, who at that time, I know he won't mind me saying, as a student at the Yale Drama School at that time, was high on something when he was writing it.
As were many students at Yale at that time.
Yes, at some point. If they could follow Lewis at that point, they could follow Samuel Beckett, the great Nobel Prize winning writer. Yeah. And one of the lines, and this brings me to your book, is a hilarious line, I think, is what was that unforgettable line? That is a line that the character Winnie says in that play. What was that unforgettable line? Of course, if it was unforgettable, how could you forget it?
Right.
Well, in your book, Rules for Being Dead, you speak quite a lot about memory. And that is fascinating to me. I'm reading Obama's book. Wow. And he too, at the very beginning, he writes about memory. He talks about remembering walking in the West Wing and all of the flood of memories that come. And in fact, in the very beginning of your book, you quote, "Memory is a complicated thing, a relative to truth, but not its twin."
Right. the great Barbara Kingsolver,
Yeah.
my favorite writer who wrote the Poisonwood Bible, said that. Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, go ahead.
And I was going to say also, though, to tie it back to
Yeah.
Sidekicked, the third line in the epigraphs at the top of the book is, Lucy, you got some splaining to do.
That's
Ricky
right.
Ricardo. So
Exactly.
everything basically comes back to Beckett or to I Love Lucy, you know, which are not that dissimilar.
That's right. That's very funny. Well, in your book about memories, you talk. I mean, the character that you have created closes his eyes. Character who's you. It's a memoir, and the whole idea of truth is also a very fascinating idea. What is true and what is not true, and in telling a story. I mean, I know this is true for me personally. Right. There are certain stories I have told so many times over and over again that I'm not even sure now where I have improved the truth and what was really happening.
Yeah,
you know?
Yeah. I mean, just an example. You know, so I have made sort of no bones about it as I've talked about this book. You know, it's fiction. There's a dead woman, you know, a mother, my mother, who's floating around in the ether trying to remember how she died, talking about memory. You know, you couldn't have something like that in a memoir, but it's basically my childhood story.
Yes.
But I thought I had such great recall about it, and I recently got an email from someone I grew up with, and she goes, you know, you got the hotel, the motel all wrong in it, didn't you? I said, what do you mean? And her family had owned this motel. That's a key location at Woods Motel. And in my mind, I saw it perfectly, and it was attached to the one nice restaurant in this small Texas town I grew up in. She goes, oh, you know, we were out on route, you know, blah, blah, blah. That was the Chevalier Hotel. I said, no, that was your hotel. She goes, no, I think I know where my hotel was. I'd got it completely wrong, you know. And it was not, you know, a kind of thing that I had to go back and do research about or anything. But somewhere along, you know, along through the years, through the decades in my memory bank, I had, you know, rearranged the architecture of small town McKinney, Texas, and made it what I needed it to be. So
yeah, and you have the voice of you as a child so specifically, and so, I mean, there are times I fell in love with the character. I mean, he's so innocent and pure and sweet and hilarious. And that was a big surprise to me, because I knew going in that it was a book about your mother, and I knew that she has died, and I knew a tiny bit about some of the circumstances. So I thought it was not going to be a happy story, but it was hilarious.
Yeah.
And one of the things you talk about, and I found this fascinating too, that your character closes his eyes, he blinks 5 times for equal. Would you tell us a little bit about that, just for the people who haven't read the book yet?
Well, I'll start with sort of one, you know, take it a step back to kind of the big story, the big kind of through line of the book. It's about, you know, and the other interesting thing about, like, I pitch it differently. You know, sometimes I pitch it, it's about a little boy whose mother dies and he doesn't know how. Right. And then sometimes I think, does that sound like a kid's book? Does that sound like a YA novel? And then the other completely valid way to look at it is it's about this middle-aged woman, you know, unhappy in her marriage, unhappy in love, who, you know, wakes up one morning, opens her eyes, and she's dead and floating in this sort of ether, neither heaven nor hell, also trying to remember what happened to her, how she died. And you take both of those together, and it's her son, this little boy who's named Clark in the book, and her name is Creola, and they are on these sort of parallel paths, both kind of playing detective to find out what happened to her. But in this specific instance, and I remember it so well, it was this, I don't think you'd call it a mnemonic, but some sort of little learning tool that one of my grade school teachers gave me, closing your eyes to sort of sear, you know, something you needed to remember onto your brain. And this little boy takes it one step further and thinks that by blinking tighter, he can remember more. And each time he blinks, he'll remember one more thing. And then in this specific instance, the mother has a history of I guess you would say of drug abuse. I mean, I think in reality, my mother was bipolar without it being diagnosed or even known about at that time.
Right.
So it was on a lot of medication I was unaware of. And this little boy innocently takes the leftover medicine she has after she's dead to the pharmacist and says, "We need more of this. What is this?" And the pharmacist itemizes all the things it could cause or that it prevents, hallucinations, seizures, psychosis, blah, blah, blah. And the little boy Clark clicks his eye. It's almost the equivalent of Dorothy clicking her heels 3 times, Yeah. He blinks his eyes 5 times to remember each one of those things that this medicine treats. And, as much as that sounds crazy and sort of fantastic, I really did pull on all these things that really happened in my childhood to remember these things. And then the other element about it is that this little boy goes to the movies every weekend to the little local movie theater called the Ritz. And he goes come hell or high water, no matter what's on, whether it's a kid's movie or something very adult like Alfie or Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. And the specific movie he goes to see right after he's been to the pharmacist is Rasputin. This sort of, seedy, sort of grade B level kind of Hammer Studios English production, and they try to kill Rasputin. It's all about killing this mad monk. And, they try to feed him poisoned candy and, Rasputin chops off somebody's hand. So little Clark remembers all the lurid things. And then he says, oh, they just should have given him the same medicine his mother takes. That would have killed him for sure. So even these, very grown-up things he's thinking, he takes them into his little boy's world and puts them into, his life situation. So.
And, here's just a little pitch, if you will, but there are many reading groups in Cape May and elsewhere. And this would be a really wonderful book for a reading group for this very reason. I mean, there are so many elements, but one of them is movies. It's a kind of a Valentine to the cinema. And apropos to your point, there's a point at which a little boy goes to see Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. It's a grown-up movie, and right. you show the advertisement that says, no, it's all about them playing games.
Fun and games. You're invited.
Right, you're
That's
invited.
What it said literally the poster. Yeah.
Right. So if I'm invited, you're invited, and fun and games. Who wouldn't want fun and games? Edward Albee himself said, it's fun and games. So you go to see it, and that again. I mean, it's funny, it's sad, and it's so specific to that child's. I mean, the fact that they, in that particular play, for those who don't remember the play, they invent a child, and then at one point they get the guests, and the games are not sweet little parlor games. They're horrible, psychologically devastating games. So
at one point in the book, one of the early versions of it, and it's very much based around this scrapbook I personally kept when I was a kid that age, in the sort of years after my mother died. He cuts out the little movie ads from the local newspaper he gets. And, it's kind of an aid memoir to remember these movies. And he makes a little scrapbook because, a lot of little kids, some kids, collect leaves and paste them in. This little boy cuts out movie ads. So clearly he's going to be gay when he grows up. I think we already know that.
Yeah.
But the original draft of the book and the version that his publishing company bought actually had those ads in the book. Every time he talked about them, there was the ad, the first, thing they said is like, well, we probably will not be able to do it with the ads. It would just cost too much money to license them and clear them and takes too much time. And then the great thing that my editor said after that was, and besides, I think they're a gimmick. she said, I think you're using them a little bit to keep from having to dig just a touch deeper to explain what those movies really meant to you and what they were about. And that kind of freed me from the artificial gimmick and had a little bit of fun to it. She's right. Now I've got to really think about how all of those movies played a part in forcing this little kid to grow up really fast.
Right.
So, yeah.
Now, the structure of the book, each chapter is only 1 or 2, perhaps at most 3 or 4 pages long.
Right.
Told from the point of view of a specific character. Did you write that? Did you go in knowing that's how the structure was going to be, or did you write one and then the next and the next?
No, not at all. And in fact, the earliest drafts and the many drafts of it were originally all from the point of view of Clark. It was going to be all Clark, essentially Clark's diary he had written. And the only thing I sort of knew from the get-go is that I wanted it all to take place in 1 year. And I wanted these, and the mother, in fact, how horrific and something out of Beckett is this. She dies on April Fool's Day.
Right.
So this little boy who already is halfway into the surreal world, his mother dies on April Fool's Day. And at first he thinks it's a joke. He can't accept that. So I wanted it to end a year later on April Fool's Day. So originally I thought it was going to be these 52 chapters, and each one was going to be built around a specific movie he had seen. And he's going to be on this journey to whatever that teaches him by the end. And someone read it, or a friend of mine read it early on, and he said, this is all about the mother, but the mother is this big missing character. And he went on to say, actually, in terms of book clubs, what he said, there were so many things wrong with it, but he said, only women buy books and only women in book clubs read books, and the books have to have women characters in them. So everything he said, had something objectionable about it, but there was a lot of truth in it. And I did think, this book is about my mother, but she's this sort of missing character. And she'd been a missing character in my life, in my real life for, 5 decades. She died when I was 9 years old. And I so much wanted to know her. And I immediately thought of, and I think maybe around that, and this shows you how long ago I started working on this, maybe one of the books that I'd read right around that time, or a book I loved that was very much in my consciousness, was this book by Alice Sebold called The Lovely Bones, which is became a huge book club book about a 14-year-old girl who's raped and murdered. And she narrates the whole book from heaven, essentially, trying to guide people around her to who killed her and everything. And I thought, it could be about this mother, but she's dead. She's watching this from some high vantage point. She's dead, but she's not omniscient. She doesn't remember the past about what happened to her. And I had originally written, and I was so excited about this new structure. And then I thought it would be these alternating chapters between the little boy and then the mother. And I'd written this first page, this mother's chapter about, finding herself kind of floating in this ether and this kind of uncomfortable feeling of almost like trying to flap her arms like they were wings and like little feathers poking out of her skin. And I wrote it in third person. Like she does this, she feels this, she feels the wind on her hair or something like that. And Jess, my husband, who you know very well, I read it to him, and we don't have one of those relationships where I read him stuff and he critiques it, and I don't look at his stuff and say, oh, do this. But for that particular thing I did, he said, oh, it's great, except just why don't you really dive into it? Make it first person. I'm feeling this, I'm feeling that, which I love reading first person books because I think it's the most immediate way of getting into the heart and soul of a character. And once I changed the mother's sections to that, she came alive. She really felt like a real person. And I kind of created this mother I would have wanted. She's sort of like the fantasy dream mother of my real mother. And she certainly has, a wicked sense of humor. How the little boy got his sense of humor from her. One of somebody who read it said, it's sinister yet adorable.
Yes,
it was such an apt description because there's real horror and thrilling moments in it, and oh my God, he's not going to do this, is he? But there's such a sweetness to it, not saccharine sweetness, but a genuine human, open-heartedness to it, both that the little boy has, and I think that Criolla, the mother, has. That I think it kind of really just puts an extra shine on them as characters,
Yes. And there's a chronology of death towards the death that all of the characters, and I found that very fascinating as well, that in 3 days, this, I'll be dead, or she will be dead. Or I didn't know then, but I now know that this was the last time this would happen. She'd be dead tomorrow. That chronology. So again, just a question, when you were writing this, did you know that was going to happen 3 days before or 2 days before?
I don't think I did. I mean, and it's very interesting because I do think I wrote it. And it's interesting because it is all, and then in addition to those 2 characters, there are probably like 3 other characters have point of view chapters. Yeah. But I do think I wrote it chronologically, and I would just skip from voice to voice.
Right.
And I'm, again, not, I knew the big turning points in it, maybe 3 or 4 big turning points, but I didn't know all those specific chapters, except I did have this sort of baseline of the first drafts of it, of everything that little Clark had written, his little movie diary. And those are also that was very specific also. I had gone back and researched those newspapers I grew up watching, and those are pretty close to exactly the movies I saw on that date. That kind of, even though it wasn't a memoir, that sort of stepping stone was important to me. But I didn't really know the specifics of what happened. And I think I sort of made it up as I went along, but I didn't, for example, write all of Criolla's chapters and then, put those aside and write all of Clark's, etc. Right. The one thing along that line I did a little bit is that once, I had some solid drafts of it in that configuration with all these different, 5 or 6 different characters telling it, I would read all of those characters. I would like excerpt all of Criolla's chapters and read them continuously to make sure the voice was the same. That, that she the vocabulary was the same, the kind of rhythm and syntax of the characters. Mm-hmm. But I also, with Clark, and I think one of the reasons I ultimately pulled back from having the whole book being his point of view is, like, I hate sort of precocious kid narrators and where it gets sort of treacly and precious. And I thought it was a little bit maybe verging on that. But he also is a very smart, beyond his years character, smart like an old man, the soul of an old man, but a smart kid, and uses kind of grown-up vocabulary to impress people. Yeah. But I also wanted him to age over the course of the book. And so I was very careful. And you only see it, I almost think if you're looking for it, how his vocabulary, his sentence structure gets longer as you go along. Yes. He sort of takes on sort of higher ways of thinking and describing stuff. So he's the one I wanted to really see grow up during the course of the book. They always say in a catharsis thing, the main character has to learn and change by the end of the play. I'm not sure if I really believe that is still a current dramatic structure, but it happened in this book that he grows up and changes by the end of the book.
Since we know you, who obviously is a writer, your job is a writer. You write for ABC for 2020. Yeah. It was really interesting for me to early on, when you talk about mourning, and you help us, the reader, learn that, well, mourning isn't the same kind of mourning as like the opposite of the evening. Right. It's not that kind of mourning. It's got a you in it. Yeah. And that changes everything.
He says it's something like, it's not the kind where you're sad. It's the kind where you wake up.
Right. Right. And also somebody who, as a child, is aware of language. The one gay character in the book uses the word a hot mess. Yeah. And the fact that it's a hot mess kind of clued you in. Oh, of course he was going to be gay.
Yeah. And then he goes on to say, or I forget if he says it or Crayola says it, the first time that phrase has ever been used. And it's, it's pulled out of chronology. And I knew it was anachronistic because the book takes place in sort of 1966, 67. Right. But I just sort of loved it. And, you point out this kind of gay character. There's several of the chapters are from the point of view of this character, Maurice Ring, who comes to play a hugely important part in the book. And he is both and this was true in real life as well. He was the janitor at the grade school my mother taught at. My mother was a 4th grade teacher. And the exact setup, both in the book and in real life, she was a 4th grade teacher. I was in the 3rd grade when she died, preventing me from actually having her as a teacher. Oh. But next to the principal, he was the only other grown-up male figure in the school. He was the janitor, cleaning up messes when students threw up, and, shining the floors every night, cleaning the erasers. But he also sort of moonlighted as a waiter at one of the restaurants in town, which this real man, Maurice Ring, did. So that is a real man. That is his real name. I knew from the time I was 8 years old, I think I knew he was a gay man without knowing what
that meant.
It was. Yeah. And I, a lot of people have asked me what's real and what's made up in it. The relationship, which is a very loving, tender, and very funny relationship between him and the mother, is made up. But it's almost my favorite relationship in the whole book, that they are there for each other.
Yes.
And he, in fact, has a happy ending, unlike what was given to most gay men or women in dramatic works of that time. He actually has a happy ending. He doesn't have to go off and kill himself or something.
Right.
And the mother says, Crayola says, she's talking about him. She goes, well, the only gay man I ever knew. And then in parentheses, she goes, well, besides my 10-year-old son. So she has this awareness that Clark doesn't.
Yeah.
And it almost feels like my gayest book without really being a gay book. There's this consciousness in its DNA that Clark is this little gay boy, learning these things. And that's what he will become, when he's of age. And he even does have a little romance by the very end of it, a crush with the high school boy who runs the projector at the movie theater. And they exchange a chaste little kiss on the cheek, which sort of means the world to Clark by the end of the book,
And even the kind of crushes that of actors on screen.
Completely, exactly.
Yeah. I love, again, just going back to the words, it just struck me, exhumed and examined, and to explain for us how close those words are. Clearly somebody who loves language.
And Clark does, in fact, and it was the chapter that I always thought I was going to have the most trouble with in terms of my editor. There's a long chapter in which Clark seemingly digs up the coffin of his mother because he's going to find out what happened to her once and for all. And he thinks if he can get to her body, he can find out what happened to her.
Right.
And it clearly, he didn't dig her up. Is it a dream sequence? Is it a fantasy? What is it? And for the longest time, it was my favorite chapter in the book. And my editors completely took it at not at face value that was real, but like, oh, of course he would have a dream like this. He would think like this. We don't need to worry about it. And I said, really? You're going to let me keep it? I was so excited.
Interesting. Yeah.
But he both examines and exhumes his mother. He loves that kind of wordplay, the cleverness of
it. The other element in the book is the sensory element. There are so many, you write almost, not to overstate it, but it's almost like remembrance of things past. You have a smell, and that informs a whole flood of memories and a whole flood of experiences. In fact, you mentioned in acting, there is something called a sense memory.
Sure, exactly.
That actors sometimes use as a tool to get to a certain place emotionally.
Well, I think you're very perceptive to pick up on that. And I did use sense memory in that. And I think, I spent some years in the wilderness in high school and college acting, you know, and
Sure.
was very much little Mr. Drama, and
Right.
thought that would be my career, and was very serious about it, and very self-important about it, but very much used sense memory, you know, as an actor. And I think it's just informed everything I've written, because I really will. And I write first drafts in a very stream of consciousness way. I will literally close my eyes and just type out the scene I see, but I pull on all my memories, you know, like, what does the seat the character's in feel like? And in many instances, he's at this kind of crappy little movie theater, and the springs are out of the seat, and he can feel the gum, you know, pasted to the seat in front of him, and all the carvings of people writing, you know, Betty loves Dawn or whatever on the seat in front of him. So all that is, you know, very much, you know, part of how I approach writing. I see it. I can only write what I see. And even really getting to the heart of some of these really tough, you know, tough scenes to write, I would do, I think, what many actors do. I would, you know, play a really compelling piece of music for me. And there are two or three go-tos that I have, you know, that can just take me immediately to that, you know, battle of the soul kind of place I needed to go to. And I would write the scenes during that and with the rhythm of that. So you can definitely see, and, you know, at other times I'll listen to, you know, like the theme song from To Kill a Mockingbird, for example. And I think there's a scene around Halloween where they go to a movie theater and the fall leaves are there. And I used the theme song from To Kill a Mockingbird as I was writing that. And I think you can really pick up on those rhythms and the, you know, when you read those chapters, you know, I, you know, even though of course I didn't become an actor, I love that I had that experience to pull on, because it's just, you need every trick in the book as a writer to just get to the next page.
Right.
It really is, you know, when you're writing, it's just like a battle to the death to get to the next page, you know, and you need all these tricks to get you there. And I have one extra one, all this kind of technique I had as an actor, you know.
Right. Well, I must say I use the same thing as a director and as an actor.
Yeah.
Music and sensory work. In fact, your character at one point, it talks, Rita, the smell is on your father.
Yeah.
But you haven't talked much about your father's character. Can you talk a little bit about that?
It's interesting because he's the last character to in the writing of it to make to earn his chapters, you know, almost like earning his stripes.
Right. Yeah.
Because the whole book is about this little boy, and this is true in my own life. And I was at various points in my life given very conflicting information. My mother died when I was 9, and nobody would really tell me what happened to her. And bit by bit, I started kind of piecing it together that she killed herself, which made a lot of sense given, you know, memories I had and little pieces of evidence. When I got out of college, and this is real life, my older brother said, no, she didn't kill herself. Our father killed her. He was having an affair with this woman, Rita, who was a character in the book, who then became my stepmother. My father married her, and he killed our mother so he could be with Rita. And not only did my older brother say this, but my mother's sister, my aunt, then started in on this, and this was their theory of what had happened. And then many, many years later, another person came up with what I think really happened to my mother. But the fact that all of these things could exist in the same world as part of this kind of perfect storm about what really happened to her, I did go through decades with this feeling that my father had killed her, and this hatred and anger at my father. And it was the hardest thing for me to face. You know, you'd think facing my mother's death would be it, but facing this real live character who I didn't really like. And the first few drafts of him, I think, were probably, you know, the standard villain, the villainous father who didn't get his little gay son, and kind of this macho Texas guy. And I thought, no, you know, if this is going to be my masterwork, if this is going to be my legacy, I want to give everybody their full term. You know, it was like you produced and directed soap operas, and one of my soap writing friends once told me this little, and I'm probably gonna get it wrong, but this sort of mantra from I think it's from Agnes Nixon, the doyenne of creating soap operas, and something like turning the jewel or turning the diamond. And what it meant was looking at every facet of it, looking at every side of it, you know, the flawed side as well as the perfect side.
Mm.
And I decided I would use that with these characters. I would look at every part of them, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And I would try to give them their grace and their experience, whether I bought into it or not. So I really went back to the childhood of my father and this horrific childhood he had, which I knew a little bit about. And whether, you know, we could claim our childhoods make us who we are or not, I would really try to give him his story, give him his dignity.
Yes.
And now that I am an adult and know how absolutely difficult life is and just getting from day to day survival is, I look back on that him, how he had to kind of, you know, accept his family. He had these three sons, and how hard it was for him to make a living. And I wanted to honor that, you know, I wanted to give him that piece of grace.
I think you did. I mean, you're very successful.
I'm proud of that. You know, I had written this essay that was published along the way when the book first came out, and the title was "Are There Bookstores in Heaven?" And it was sort of my Southern Baptist guilt, wondering, you know, what friends and relatives in heaven would think about this, especially all the characters I write about. You know, my mother, my father, my stepmother. You know, if they wandered into an indie bookstore, hopefully instead of a Barnes and Noble, to buy this book, would they think, oh, he's attacked us, he doesn't know who we were? And I think they'd actually be proud of it. Like he gave me my due. He told my story, you know, he kept my name alive. And that was my attempt.
Right. Well, you know, the genre, you touched on it earlier, of, you know, is this, you know, a memoir, or is it, you know, a romance novel? In some ways, you know, it's a guy having an affair. Or is it a murder? You know, it's a thriller, a murder thriller, and it really exists on all levels.
Yeah.
I mean, you really the murder aspect of it. At first, you know, you're not quite sure. I mean, did she overdose on pills, or did your father, you know, kill her so he could be with his mistress?
Yeah, it's really genre bending, and that was not really deliberate. But I you know, there was a long period in my life before I started writing books, an unsuccessful period where I tried to write screenplays, which are so, you know, compact and compressed, and every scene needs to lead to the next scene. And whether I discovered this on my own or just this was something I'd sort of discovered about writing, everything has to start with a question, like, you know, and there's the mystery of life. You know, there's a mystery inherent in even life, like just how do you survive it? How do you get to the next page? But there's a very implicit question in this one, like what happened to this woman? And then various very possibilities are floated: suicide, murder, or something else. So it took the form of a mystery without me setting out to write that. And there's this inherent suspense that builds, especially as you get near the end, what's going to happen. And you think other characters are going to get killed, maybe. And I'm happy to say that a lot of different communities have picked up the book, and the sort of mystery thriller reading community has really supported it because it lives in that. But it also is literary fiction. You know, there's an element of memoir to it. It's coming of age. It's a mother-son story. It really just has a little bit of everything in it.
Yeah, that's why when we first started, I said I'll hold it up again for everybody, just in case you haven't seen it. It's rules. Let's see if I got it back here. Rules for being dead. Really would make a great book for book clubs, but also, you know, I kept seeing it very cinematically. There are certain scenes that are, for example, the scene where Clarky, I mean, he accuses his father of murdering your mother, and your father goes to attack him, and he runs out and goes over a fence and onto a swimming pool, and the tarp that's there to protect people is the very thing that makes him that collapses, and he ends up breaking his arm. I mean, it's horrible, but it's very funny.
It's very funny and very real. Every one of those little elements you said has some basis in reality, whether it happened to me or happened to in other stories I knew of happening. And I think it's very cinematic. I mean, even the fact of the mother being a ghost, which would maybe make some people think it's outside that. So real, and she's so much remembering her history and her backstory. Oh my God, that would just be my dream come true to have it, be a movie or a mini series or something. And
I can't see it that way, absolutely. And it just so happens in my own family, my daughter ended up just recently getting married to a boy from a tiny town in Texas.
Yeah,
a tiny town in Texas. So I'm a New Yorker. Grew up in New York City and spent most of Los Angeles, and then went to this tiny town in Texas, and talk about a fish out of water. I mean, it was really instructive for me. So it really resonated for me.
Yeah, and and that's the name of the real town. It's McKinney, and a lot of people ask me. I know people who've written things that are clearly based on certain town or whatever. Did I ever think about changing the name? And I just didn't at all. I mean, it just was so real. And the McKinney of today is very different from the McKinney of
1960,
50 years ago, 1966. But it made me very, I missed that little town, and everybody has a little town in their life. I think whether they grew up in one or not,
Oh, sure. Absolutely. Yeah. Well, New York City, I mean, that's a cliche, but it is a series of little towns.
Yeah. And it's just a sense of home. It's a sense of what your childhood was, I think.
Right. Right. I still just remembering this one moment in your little town. There's an ice cream parlor called Sabine's. And again, a little boy looks at that, but has the sophistication to know the rape of the Sabine women.
Completely. Meanwhile, the mother is sort of forcing her class and her little boy on this kind of Bataan death march through a storm to get ice cream. And she's so crazy, she thinks she's sort of done them this great favor, and she's going to treat her class to ice cream. And meanwhile, this kind of, Wizard of Oz like tornado is whipping around them, and glass and leaves and tree limbs are blowing. And it represents pretty well the chaos of Creola's mind, I think, and this kind of love-hate life she had.
Yeah.
And, the sophistication of this little boy who knew grown-up literature, and who, at age 10 is trying to check out In Cold Blood from the library.
Right.
From as the librarian in reality said to me, from that fruitcake Truman Capote, but he knows it exists as a book. He wants to read it,
Right.
So.
Right. And the metaphor of the tornado is actually, I found that fascinating too, because it's used throughout the book. But the first time you bring it up, it's your father in a romantic way speaking of tornadoes of passion and love for your mother when he was courting her.
He calls it tornadoes of love.
Yeah.
Which I can, which is a phrase I made up, and I'm proud of it.
Yeah, it's great.
I think he says carousels and windmills and tornadoes of love, which was a little bit to try and say that even this army man, this kind of crude guy, this alcoholic, had a touch of the poet in him,
Sure.
that he could come up with a phrase like that and really believed in it and meant it at one point in his young life and in the relationship of these two people. So,
yeah. Well, again, that's one of the things, and my hat is off to you, because one of the things that I've always been attracted to in art and literature and in life is when someone you don't expect to have flights of poetry does. Yeah. I mean, sometimes in a hilarious way. I mean, I remember seeing a sketch about sanitation department guys who were picking up sets outside the New York City Opera and the ballet. And you got these, New York guys saying, damn, Nureyev, and
Right.
he hold a candle, whatever.
Right, exactly.
But that actually happens.
Yeah,
And working in film and television and in theater, I've met so many union stagehands and grips who have very sophisticated tastes
yeah,
and have seen all sorts of avant-garde theater and dance
yeah.
and can talk about it, in some depth. And just
Well,
because they happen to be blue collar doesn't mean they don't know about it.
exactly. And just sort of going back to something you had said earlier, it is it's very quickly, and I'm thrilled about this, being discovered by book clubs.
Yeah.
And you're reading them, and I've zoomed in with many of them, and participated. And at first I thought, oh, it's only going to really work for somebody, of a certain age who can sort of remember these movies from the 60s and what that was like. And, there are a lot of older people who are in book clubs and they love it for that reason. But even some, much younger people, at the bottom line, it's a story about grief. It's a story about somebody dying and other people trying to deal with that. And everybody, no matter what age, often has an experience of that. But there's just so much in it. And I do think the sense of humor, unintentional humor, it's not like they're comics or making jokes, but that Clark and Creole make it a little bit of a it makes it a little user friendly. If it were a completely grim, humorless book, same story, but without this sort of sweet innocence it has, I think it would be a tough book to read.
Yes.
But I think the sweetness that they sort of have and this yearning to find out the truth really gets you through to the end of the book. Mm-hmm. And it really does pick up a pace like a thriller by the end.
Yeah. And
there's so many outrageous stories. A lot of the things that people think are made up because they're outrageous are really things that really happened.
Sure.
So,
right.
So I think there's also a fun guessing game, like, oh, what happened? What didn't happen?
Right, exactly. Well, do you know what's next on your agenda? Do you have something else you're writing, or can you tell us?
I've started, I've written a draft or two about, I can't go back to the well and cut out this pound of flesh anymore. Mm-hmm. I've sort of used up all the family stories, all the family skeletons, thank God. So I feel like I only want to write comedy from now on. Uh-huh. So I'm sort of working on this sort of very satirical kind of murder mystery thing set in a news environment. Oh. And it's sort of the Devil Wore Prada, but in the news business.
Right.
And it's called Hot Mic. And a hot mic is an open mic that you pick up unintentionally things on. But there's also a hot anchor man that they all teasingly call Hot Mic in it. And it's a little bit all about Eve meets the Devil Wore Prada, but with men.
Yeah. Oh, funny. It's fun.
I'm having fun working on it. Yeah.
That's great. Well, thank you, Kim. Thank you so much for being with us. Thank you for your play.
I loved it.
And I hope the people who are listening to this, if you get an opportunity, I hope it's playing somewhere in wherever you are. It's a wonderful called Sidekicked. Perhaps we'll be able to do some version of it again.
Yes.
I would love that. And I must tell you, for your friends who said that only women are parts of book clubs, that this is an absolute leaving New York and going to Los Angeles. And all of my New York snobby friends, provincial New York friends, and I probably include myself in that group.
Right.
That if you're going to LA, they're all idiots. They're all shallow. They only think about working out and eating, skinless chicken breasts and lettuce. And you're going to be miserable. You'll be coming back to New York. Well, the very first thing that happened was I was asked to join a reading group, and in my reading group was an on-air news personality. There was a doctor. There was a writer, men and women of all different ages, all very brilliant. I mean, in their own fields. And we read books that had nothing to do with any of our fields. So here I was, a producer, director, and we ended up reading a book about Islam,
Yeah.
Well,
and the great thing I've been seeing about book clubs is that they're continuing during COVID. when they're all
Absolutely.
actually, it's one thing to like, go over to Betty's house at night and have a few cocktails and sit around and sort of gossip and you kind of talk about the book. But these people are hardcore and they are having their Zoom book clubs and
Yep.
really seriously talking about books. And
Well,
it's
right
a way
now, my
to sort of
wife,
beat the
yeah,
social isolation we're all going through right
I
now.
was going to say, my wife is reading Moby Dick
Oh
and
my
having
God.
very intellectual discussions with her book club. You know,
Absolutely.
so,
Yeah.
not for the faint of heart.
Well, thank you to Kate May for the change it made in my life and for just everything you're continuing to do during this very tough time.
Well, thank you so much for that. We really appreciate
Yeah.
that. And again, just a shout out to your husband, Jess Goldstein, an for Tony Award winning costume designer who is a dear friend from our days back in grad school.
Thank you. I'll pass it on. Absolutely.
I saw him wandering around in the back. You look lost. So.
Exactly.
Okay, all the best. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Roy. Bye-bye. Take care.